Coming up on Avant Technology Insights with Ken Presti.
You cannot have a rational conversation about network without talking about security in today's day and age. And you cannot have a rational conversation around security without understanding the network.
Secure Access Service Edge, better known as SASE, is a framework for IT security that encompasses a number of technologies that provide different functions but come together in a way that's designed to deliver defense in depth, or a layered approach to security that involves various capabilities that are complementary to one another. SASE is also the subject of an Avant 612 report, which delivers market research and a variety of perspectives on the subject. Download that free report at goavant.net/SASE, but for now we've got a podcast for you in just a moment. Welcome to Avant Technology Insights. I'm your host, Ken Presti, Vice President of Avant Research and Analytics. The link between solving business challenges and cutting-edge technologies has become tighter and more complex than ever before. In this podcast series from Avant Research and Analytics, we help enterprise decision makers sort through the business case, the value, the challenges, and ultimately the bottom line of technology adoption. So listen to us at your desktop, take us in the car, tune in from the commuter train, or download us at the gate. You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, and Google, as well as at www.goavant.net/podcast. My guest today is a 20-year veteran of the IT channel with demonstrated success in technical sales, training, and presentations to support wide area networks, voice, IT strategy, professional services, and of course, IT security. He's a security product specialist at Masergy. I want to welcome Rich Korn. Rich, thanks for being on the show today. Very happy to speak with you again. You were instrumental in the development of the SASE 612 report, and I very much appreciate your coming back to have some additional discussions on this time for our podcast audience. Secure Access Service Edge means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. How do you define it? In terms of, is this a technology, is this a framework, or is it something else altogether?
Great question, and you're spot on. The term is here. And really what's happening in the industry right now is every vendor is trying to spin it to make themselves fit that particular definition. To me, it is a framework. I hate the definition itself. The definition, quite frankly, can lead to a false sense of security or to an improper solution. Going back to what I mentioned, from our last conversation with regards to customization, every customer's environment is going to be different. So what I'd like to focus on when it comes to SASE is desired outcomes. And really the two desired outcomes of SASE are improving application performance and improving security. So what components of network, what components of security is going to help accomplish that goal for the customer is going to vary from customer to customer because their environments are completely different. So that's why I like to look at it as a framework. Now let's pick the networking components. Let's pick the security components for that individual customer to accomplish those two goals.
Okay, that makes sense. One of the things I noticed in talking to you is you have a tendency to put the network component in front of the security component. A lot of people, when they think about SASE, they think fundamentally about security first. Do you do that consciously, or is that, do you see the network piece as superseding the security, or do you see it the other way around, or are they co-equals?
They're going to be co-equal. You cannot have a rational conversation about network without talking about security in today's day and age. And the reverse is also true. You cannot have a rational conversation around security without understanding the network. So when I talk about them, I tend to start with the network, mostly because in the agent and the partner community, most people understand the network better than they do security. I hate to phrase it this way, it's a little bit less complex because there's less moving parts where security has to encompass everything. Being more complex, less knowledgeable with regards to the agent community, or probably should say less comfortable. And that is also very true with most customers. Most customers have networking people, but not security people. So I tend to start with the network just from an understanding perspective, And then the security has to encompass everything.
Okay, so in other words, I'm going to start on the network side because that's the thing that I probably know the most. I'm going to kind of get my sassy shoes on and get a sense of how this whole thing comes together, and then focus more completely on the security side. Is that a fair?
Exactly.
Is that what you said? Okay,
Yep.
all right. You also said, and this was a good one. This we actually used this one as an out quote in the report. You said that that sassy is a journey and not a destination. Pick that apart for me, please.
Yeah, that goes back with the definition, and
Hmm.
like what I like to say, it's customized, and it is that framework. You have to understand where you're at today as a customer. What do I need to have today from a networking perspective, from a security perspective? But then, more importantly, almost is how does that solution evolve as my environment changes? We're putting in 3, 5 year long contracts from a network perspective, from a security perspective. How's my environment going to change over the course of the next 3 years? Am I putting more and more information in the cloud? Am I pulling data back from the cloud back to on prem? How's my security posture, my growth, my acquisitions? So, how do I get visibility into that particular environment from both an application performance perspective and a security perspective to make sure that that solution can evolve with me over time as my environment changes over time?
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense, and that's one of those things that I'm guessing that's going to cause us to bring a lot of people to the table because you've got to look not only at what's happening on the network right now and what kind of security needs you need to meet right now. You've also got to look at what that future holds, and I'm guessing you got to bring a lot of people to the table to get a sense of where they're going, so that you can coordinate all this effectively.
Exactly. One of the things I like to tell customers, and especially the partner community, is that process, because you're now integrating network and security. You have to have your networking people, you have to have your security people, but it doesn't stop there. A lot of
Hmm.
those changes are being driven by risk and compliance, regulatory based components. And then, of course, you have to have the purse strings. So I tell partners all the time, you need to have your IT people involved in those conversations, your risk compliance team involved in those conversations, and executive leadership involved in those conversations. And if you can get those three segments on the same page, that's what you need to do in order to accomplish those goals.
Okay, so as you have these discussions that you were just talking about, and you look at this from the standpoint of this framework that includes, ZTNA and CASB and SD-WAN and remote browser isolation, perhaps, and all of these things, how do you go about bringing all this together in a way that makes the most sense in your particular environment? What would you say is the process for looking at what you've got and doing that assessment and then starting to map out kind of the linear process of bringing all this together?
Collaboration and partnership, simple as that. You need to have the partner, you need to have the customer's resources, and then you need to have technical resources, whether that be somebody from Avant that has that expertise to have that kind of a conversation. Some partners have the internal technical expertise or a trusted vendor such as Masergy. And you need to have that conversation in a whiteboard format where you start talking through what are applications? Where do we have our data? How are we going to have it connected? Who's going to manage it? Who's going to monitor it? And you begin to piece all these different questions and that components of that puzzle together so that you end up with the right solution. And that really takes a lot of collaboration, a lot of partnership, and a lot of trust, which is really built by taking I'm going to call it a non-vendor approach to that. It really becomes a consultative process as opposed to a sales process.
So when we look at these technologies, so you got ZTNA, you've got, CASB, you got SD-WAN, and there's a host of things. Which of the component parts would you say are the most important ones to really examine and really learn?
That is a great question. And the answer in a typical engineering fashion is it depends. That goes back to every customer's environment being different. So, first thing you need to do is figure out what the customer's environment is, what their needs end up being, figure out how are they defining these different components. We like to say a lot of times that there's so much information out there on the internet, right? Customers come in with an idea of what they think they need, And some of them are further along that path. They might know what they need. So one of the challenges we have is really coming in and questioning their assumptions. There's so much information out there right now that it really becomes impossible to understand what those options really are, how they're being defined. You mentioned ZTA in a couple different times. There are so many different definitions out there of zero trust, just like there's so many different definitions out there of SASE. And that's where that conversation comes into play. So the answer to your question as to which is the most important really is going to vary from customer to customer. So I like to tell the partners is not so much figuring out what the most important aspect is, but figuring out what they can be comfortable with in order to sell the meeting. I use endpoint detection or response as an example. It's not part of the SASE definition. Quite frankly, it should be. In my opinion, that's the single best value and should be the fastest growing product you're going to see out there. I think a lot of the experts right now are saying it's CASB because of SaaS. So maybe you become conversant enough in endpoint detection or response to have that conversation, to raise their awareness, to sell the meeting with those trusted experts we spoke about earlier. And then that's where the conversation begins to expand from there.
It's interesting because whenever anything new comes down the pike, everybody gets into Me Too mode. So everybody's got a story around SASE, just like back in the days when we had, voice over IP and that was first coming out. Everybody had a story around that, whether it was IP or not, was debatable. We're seeing this in the SASE space as well. Is it important to me as an enterprise decision maker to learn the new technology based on the fundamentals of what I've already got installed, or do I need to take a higher level look at it? So for example, when we look at SASE, we can look at it in an as a service type of environment, or we may have a number of hardware appliances for different things, firewalls and such, scattered through our network. So do we have to look at it from the standpoint of what we already have invested in, or should we take that fresh look and maybe we need to make bigger changes than we otherwise thought?
The answer to that question is also it depends. It depends on what you have in place. How old is it? Does what you have satisfy your requirements for what you need? And that's where the part of that conversation comes into play. So when you start looking at the definitions that are out there, I use an example of this. I talked to a CIO a few weeks ago, and we were talking about salespeople and approaches. And the salesperson was coming in talking about industry trends. And the CIO's response to that was, I don't care. They didn't care about industry trends. All they were concerned with was how does that apply to my specific environment? And so that's where that conversation needs to start. So yes, you need to understand what does that customer have in place? How does that apply to what the real needs are based on that collaborative conversation, that whiteboarding conversation, if you will. And then ideally, if we can incorporate those existing investments, yeah, let's do it. There's no point in coming in and ripping out your entire kitchen to remodel it. If 90% of it still works, let's just tweak what needs to be changed. Maybe we need to change the island. So it really comes into what do we have in place? What do we need? What can we reuse? And then how do we fill in those gaps?
How did you feel about that "I don't care" answer? Because, we talk a lot on this podcast and elsewhere about leveraging technology as a differentiator. And that kind of by definition implies that you do care because you're looking at what your competitors are doing. You're looking at where you may be able to leverage technology to get ahead or at least not fall behind, which implies, in my mind anyway, that you do care about at least what other people in your vertical market are doing with respect to technology. Do you think that's a responsible approach, or is it just one where people aren't necessarily interested in looking at technology all that closely? They're just looking at the end result?
The focus needs to be on the end result for that specific environment. So, and I'll give you an example of this. You're hearing right now all this conversation about SASE. Whatever percentage of organizations are going to SASE. Well, then you have that definition based component. So you can have everyone talking about, yeah, we're all going to SaaS based environments. Well, what if you live in a remote area and all of a sudden you start putting all of your data out there in the cloud? as opposed to on-prem, and now it takes longer to get to it. You're in a remote area where you can't get good redundant connectivity, and it actually negatively affects your operations. So while you need to be concerned with what the industry is kind of looking at and where things are and what's available, the more important component for each individual CIO is how does that technology affect my specific environment? And that's what he was referring to when he said, I don't care about the industry and what other people are doing. I need to be concerned with what I'm doing. So, yes, you need to know what's available, you know what your competition is doing, but then you need to have that conversation of how does this apply? Does it apply to me? Or is there a better way for me to do this based on my specific environment?
All right. So really what you've been talking about up until this point is the ability to dissect what your needs are, what your components are that are already in place, what your desired end state looks like, and then being able to map that out with your trusted advisor to figure out what you need, when you need it, and what order you need it in. Is that correct?
Exactly. And you hit on the important part when you said, with my trusted advisor. There's so
Right.
much out there. Their job is to understand their own environment. They're not going to know what all those options really are. That's where the trusted advisor comes into play to help them collaboratively put that solution together. Question what that CIO is thinking based on their own research, just to verify that it is in fact what they should be doing.
Okay. So help me unpack zero trust network access. So that's in the alphabet soup, the always evolving alphabet soup of our industry. That's one of the big ones right now, because basically it says you are guilty until proven innocent, and if you deserve to get onto this network or access these resources, you have to prove that to me right now, Mister. And that's basically where that goes from an overall fundamental standpoint of it. What are you seeing in terms of adoption of ZTNA, how well it's actually serving that end state, and where things are going in that area?
I just did an event recently where we spent probably a half an hour ripping on ZTNA. And that's probably an unfair statement, a bad way to phrase that. Very much like there's a lot of different definitions of SASE, and you used the voice over IP analogy earlier in the cloud. As people in the industry are talking about zero trust, everyone's trying to put their own spin on it. So the first thing you need to understand is what is it based on how that customer is defining it, how they should be looking at it, because there's a lot of different options out there. So zero trust to me is a philosophy. Yeah, you've got your point products. There's zero trust point products out there. And those to me are kind of a joke because they can actually create a false sense of security. I like to use a gym analogy, right? Zero trust network access. Do I have access to the gym? Yes or no? Okay, great, you do. But different people then should have different policies of what they can do within the gym. And then just because they have access to a part of the gym or to do something within the gym doesn't mean they always do it as part of their job. So if all of a sudden the behavior changes, that should be triggering a concern. My reason for bringing it up that way, three different layers: access controls, policy controls, and then behavioral monitoring, is because the biggest threat, I think it was 76%, the SANS Institute said, of the most damaging breaches, meaning actual data loss, came from within organizations, not from without. These are people that had trusted credentials. These are people that zero trust network access wasn't going to stop. And in fact, depending on how it's being defined, some of those point products that create a TLS tunnel from point A to point B and deny visibility into that tunnel can actually eliminate the ability to do policy enforcement and behavioral monitoring, making it actually easier to get away with stealing information. So that's what, to me, it really needs to be that defense in depth component. It has to be all three layers when you start talking about a zero trust philosophy.
Okay, so what specifically would you be inclined to look at as an option to defend against that vulnerability where you've got ZTNA, but you just described a pretty interesting little workaround. In a true defense in depth environment, what would you be using to counter that?
Again, it depends on the environment. But in general, you want to have some semblance of a tight access control. And when there's different definitions of ZTNA out there, some of them don't have to do that tunnel from A to B. They might do, let's do it to an authentication inside the environment. And then you can still go ahead and have that visibility and policy enforcement beyond that. So some different layers, different levels. So when I start talking about, and use the great phrase, defense in depth, I do want to have strict access controls, single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, etc. But then I don't want to have it to the point where I lose my visibility. So I want to be able to have policy enforcement based on identity access management, things like Active Directory. And I want to be able to modify that policy based on different variables. Maybe it's time of day. So maybe if I'm going to the gym, the climbing wall is only open until 8 o'clock p.m. So I can go to the climbing wall within the gym until 8 o'clock, but then my policy changes at 9 o'clock and I no longer have access to that based on where I'm at, where I'm logging in from. There's a whole lot of different variables you can begin to customize based on user and group policy enforcement. And then you need to have that 24/7 monitoring of your environment. Security is about visibility everywhere there's data, including in transit. So how am I going to get that 24/7 monitoring and then have that behavioral aspect to monitor what someone is doing when they go to that gym? Okay, this person has access to the swimming pool, but they've never been there. All of a sudden, they're going swimming 4 days in a row. That's a behavioral change. Maybe they're just trying to get into shape. Maybe they're giving their card to a friend to go in or giving their credentials away. And so they have the same credentials, but the actual behavior, the change in the behavior triggers that maybe it's not the same person using those credentials.
Right.
That's what defense in depth comes into play.
It's an interesting thing. I mean, it comes out of military circles. I mean, it was originally a military approach to defense before it was a technology approach to protecting the network. It's kind of an interesting thing where you've got a certain opportunity for things to fail or at least complement one another. As we look at SASE, and you look at SASE and all of its component parts, and those component parts, for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, these are technologies that have been around for quite some time. With that in mind, is SASE kind of an artificial construct that, is just a means of delivering different things that we've already got? Or is this truly a game changer, if you will?
I love the concept of the industry trying to force the integration of network and security. It really, frankly, is something that I'm going to call it smart partners and smart customers have been doing for over a decade. The industry is now trying to, almost going to say force that. They're really striving to push customers that direction. I think the challenge is, so in that essence, it's nothing new. It's something that's been around. Smart people have been doing it for a while already, but it hasn't really been pushed so much by the industry as required, quote unquote, if you will, as I'm talking in air quotes. Mm-hmm. The industry is trying to push that direction. I think that's a good thing. The problem is they tried to define it. And as soon as you put a definition on something, you've now pigeonholed it. I like to use compliance as an example. Compliance at its base is a good thing. It's saying, hey, here are the minimum requirements of what you need to be doing from a security perspective. The problem is too many people in risk compliance departments are now thinking you just need to check the box and that it's all I have to do to be secure, when in fact it's the bare minimum. And I think the definition of SASE is kind of having that exact same approach. I've seen RFPs and I've seen people put spreadsheets together. Hey, what are your SASE components? And the customer shouldn't even be looking at that particular SASE definition for their specific environment. It's the wrong fit. But they see the definition that came out, therefore they say, this is what I have to be doing. And that can be dangerous because that can now lead to a false sense of security. It can lead to negative application performance as opposed to improving application performance.
SASE is defined in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people. What would you say are the core components of that definition that should be the working model as companies move forward?
Yeah, so the answer to that question I'm most familiar with is one that is really out there from Gartner. Gartner has such a huge influence. They put it out there, which is why I said that the term is there. And the term is not going to change. And that's why you see all the different vendors out there trying to spin it, if you will, as to how they apply it. And we're no different. We put our own little definition as to how we fit that particular definition. That can be very, very dangerous. When you start talking about SD-WAN, when you start talking about zero trust network access and CASB and secure web gateway, and you have firewall as a service in the cloud, the definition, frankly, was really written by a few specific vendors with Gartner. And just like an RFP, right? If you're writing the definition, you're going to write it to make yourself look good.
Hmm.
And Gartner actually contradicted themselves as part of their definition. They've been saying since what, June of 2016, that detect and respond are critical to a good security environment. Not important, critical. Yet they didn't put it as part of the definition.
Hmm.
And I think part of that reason is the people that helped them write it don't do SOC as a service. And as a result of that, you ended up with this definition that isn't really complete. Endpoint detection and response is not part of the definition. And if you look at the industry, with all the ransomware attacks out there, a good managed EDR solution would have solved for all of that. And that's exactly why that's the definition that's out there, is the Gartner definition. And the exact reason why I don't like it is because it assumes more of a greenfield environment, no brick and mortar, everyone's working remote, and every application that the customer has is out in the cloud. And even then, it still doesn't do a very good job as a comprehensive security solution, mostly because it doesn't have EDR, endpoint detection and response. And
Hmm.
that's why I like to stress the fact that customers and partners really need to be looking at it as a framework and then modifying for each customer how they're going to fit that framework.
Okay, so we've talked about definitions. We've talked about ways in which different companies are approaching it in various types of methodologies and different types of systems. We've talked about the industry pushing certain aspects of this forward. In this kind of a mix, what do you anticipate the security world is going to look like 2 to 3 years from now as these things continue to take hold?
I get similar questions to that quite a lot. I see a few things coming into play. Number
Hmm.
one, and I don't like this, I see a lot more of security being driven as you begin to see more and more compliance, stricter and stricter compliance coming out. And unfortunately, a lot of this compliance gets written by politicians and by lawyers and not by security experts. And as a result of that, I think you're going to end up with a little more people trying to force compliance components. A lot of things now are coming in with regards to cybersecurity insurance. That is a huge, giant joke, in my opinion. That should be your last line of defense, not your first line of defense. And if you read the fine print on a lot of those, if you don't have a managed EDR solution, it's a violation and it's considered gross negligence.
Hmm.
So I see compliance driving a lot of security, which to me is not so much a good thing, because it's going to lead to a lot of false senses of security, because compliance, again, is the bare minimum. I see a lot more automation coming into play. Things like SOAR platforms and those kinds of environments. That is a good thing, because you want to be able to take as much data from as many different data points as you can get your hands on and correlate together holistically. That's how I get the best visibility. But it can also become dangerous because you cannot replace the people part of that equation. It's got to be that combination of technology, process, and people in order to be effective. Going back again, because every customer's environment is going to be different. What might be normal for one customer might not be normal for another customer. And so trying to do it with technology alone is going to be very, very dangerous. And then the third thing I think I'm seeing right now is looking at the different numbers coming out. I don't think remote workers are going to be going away. I think they're going to continue to grow. And therefore, having that visibility into the endpoints is going to become even more critical. And that's why I'm such a huge proponent of endpoint detection and response as a starting point. I think you're going to see antivirus go away in the next 3 to 5 years. I think it's going to be replaced by endpoint detection and response solutions. And
Hmm.
then CASB also comes into play in that, as you start seeing more and more remote work environments. You need to have more and more customization as far as policy across multiple applications. So you want a way to centralize that management based on the IIM integration, as opposed to trying to manage policies in all these individual applications. That becomes too cumbersome.
Interesting stuff. You know, the thing about security in particular is that I can take basically anything in IT, and if it's working right, I will know. And if it's working right today, it will probably be equally effective next week and the week after that. This is not the case with security. I mean,
Correct.
the security changes minute by minute, which is why you need trusted advisors that can really track this and have the right expertise either in-house or within reach. So it's a really interesting space, and I can see SASE and the things that you talked about really being kind of the next horizon on all this. So, Rich Korn, security product specialist at Masergy, thanks much for your time today. Also, thanks for your great contributions to the SASE 612 report that Avant has launched. We appreciate your time on that as well. It's a great report. Check out our website, download it. We thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Ken.
You've been listening to Avant Technology Insights with Ken Presti, featuring information and opinions on how key technologies can be leveraged to solve business problems. Avant Technology Insights is a service of Avant Communications, a platform for IT decision-making. All opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guest and the host. For more information, please feel free to download our research reports and other resources at www.goavant.net. That's www.goav as in victory, ant.net. For Avant Research and Analytics, I'm Ken Presti.